Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
It's 8:03. If you've just joined us, we're spending the whole hour talking about assisted dying because it is a really important parliamentary debate tomorrow. It's going to last 5 hours. Some people think it probably should last a lot longer than that, given the complexity of the subject, but it is a private member's bill. The fact that it's being debated on a Friday is because it is a private member's bill. It's not government business. And normally on a Friday, there are very few MPs in Parliament. There are not going to be 650 there tomorrow, but there will be, I imagine, quite a few hundred MPs debating this. And I just hope that the debate, that they actually get time, because you can't make whatever side you're on, you can't make a speech on this in 2 minutes. It's just impossible. I mean, it's why when we take calls, I'm not going to shut a caller up after 2 minutes when they're in the middle of telling an emotional story about what's happened to them and how that informs their views. So we will be taking your calls in this hour. And we're going to be in the company of Paul Blomfield, chair of the campaign group Dignity in Dying and a former Labour MP, whose father Harry took his own life aged 87 in 2011 after being diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. And also Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who's chief executive of the campaign group Care Not Killing. So the two sides of the debate, head to head. We're going to have a calm, rational debate, aren't we, gentlemen?
We certainly are.
And I'm going to try and stay out of it as much as possible because you two are the experts on both sides of this argument. Do you think, I mean, Paul, let's start with you. Do you think that it's been a reasoned debate so far? It doesn't seem to have got too emotional.
No, I think it has been. And I think everybody has been concerned to ensure that we focus on the arguments and we recognise that at the centre of this, we're talking about dying people. And many of those have been hugely involved in the campaign. So it's been a respectful debate, and I think Kim Leadbeater has set that tone as well in the way that she's gone about consulting all sides in preparing her bill.
Gordon?
Well, I think that I've been actually pleasantly surprised by how balanced the media debate has been over the last few weeks. I mean, from our perspective, we feel that the media often looks for sensationalist stories and doesn't really engage the issues.
How dare you?
So we have been impressed, I think, that there has been a more serious debate in the media. And I hope, in Parliament too, I expect that will be the case tomorrow. Actually, every time this issue is debated in Parliament, we get MPs saying afterwards, or MSPs in the Scottish context saying that's the best debate we've ever participated in, because it's where people actually genuinely express their views. They think about the issues. A lot of people are undecided, understandably. They see both sides of the argument. And so it's one of the rare opportunities where MPs actually get the opportunity to think about an issue and not just do as they're told by their whips.
Let me ask you both the same question. What do you think is your strongest argument, and what do you think is your opponent's weakest argument? Because a lot of the arguments have now been very well rehearsed. There don't seem to be many new angles to this. But Gordon, let's start with you. What do you think your strongest argument is?
Well, I think it's about fundamentally what sort of society do we want to be? Do we want to be a society which cares for people who are vulnerable, which provides support as people approach the end of life, which doesn't see them as being almost, beyond help. And the big danger of this is that although we all understand why people want this, the big danger is the impact that it has on society. And I think, clearly Paul's side of the argument argues very strongly for individual autonomy and choice, but what they don't talk about, and this is probably their weakest, is the impact on wider society, and they tend to avoid talking about that because it's difficult for them.
Paul?
I think our strongest argument, and the one that has driven the campaign, is the status quo. That if we don't make this change, where does it leave us? And it leaves us with thousands of people, as the Office for Health Economics confirmed again this week, facing painful deaths at the end of their lives, suffering because there's a complete comprehensive ban on assisted dying. And it leaves us with many people like my father who, having at the age of 87 seen too many of his friends die badly, decided to take matters into his own hands. It also leaves us with a law that does actually at the moment, in some ways, allow assisted dying. You can go to Dignitas if you've got the money, but that's not available to everybody. You can voluntarily stop eating and drinking, literally starve yourself to death, as some people do, and it's an awful way to go. And what is the logic of allowing a painful and suffering assisted death, but not a humane and compassionate one? So I think that's where our strongest argument is, and I think that's why we get so much support from the public, because people have seen that case.
Sorry, carry on.
I was going to go up to the weakest argument, but
No, go on. No, carry on.
I think the opponent, our opponent's weakest argument has been about the slippery slope. They argue that if we start with a law limited to terminal illness, we will inevitably end up with a law which is much broader, like Canada.
Aren't they right on that, though?
No, they're not actually, because
MND isn't going to be included in this bill. People who suffer from that. Multiple sclerosis, somebody thinks that isn't either. And I mean, there is a logic to including both of them in it. And that presumably, Gordon, that is something that you are concerned about.
Well, I mean, there are lots of slippery slopes, actually, and they take different forms in different places. Canada's the clearest example, where it was extended from terminal illness to chronic illnesses, as you've said, and is currently planned to be extended to just mental illness in 2027. But even if you go to Oregon, which is often held up as being the example to follow, we see that they have reinterpreted the definition of terminal illness. So if people refuse treatment now, that's deemed to be terminal illness. We see that people who are depressed are not getting psychiatric support or evaluation, and people cite that they feel being a burden. And even Kim Leadbeater said this morning on the radio that she thought that being a burden was a reason to opt for assisted suicide. But if people feel that they're a burden on their friends or their family, actually, we should seek to give them support and reassure them that they're not a burden. And I think that's what I come back to. It's fundamentally about what is our attitude to people when they get older, whether it be older relatives or other people in the community. Do we just abandon them? Because this is really about abandonment. It's not actually about relieving suffering. It's about abandonment of people.
It's not about abandonment. It's about choice. People, and our campaign is driven in significant part by people who have seen their loved ones die awfully. Some of our brave campaigners, and I've just left some of them this evening, who are themselves dying now with no hope. They know that this law can't be brought in time to save them the end that they fear, but they're committed to the campaign because they want to save it for others. Now, people talk about the vulnerable. Who could be more vulnerable than those at the end of their lives? And why is it so wrong to give them the choice not to end their lives, but to shorten their deaths?
I mean, that's a good soundbite, but I mean, Gordon, presumably that's all you think it is. But there surely is an element of truth in that. In that if somebody, I mean, we all want to have this so-called good death. I don't think any death can ever be a good death in traditional terms. But we would rather die in circumstances that were less horrible than the alternative, wouldn't we?
Absolutely, of course we would. And, I think you've got to unpick really what are people's actual motivations. So fear of pain or experience of pain is in fact one of the lower motivations that people opt for this overseas. What drives people is loss of a sense of enjoyment of life, loss of ability to do things they used to do, fear of being a burden, as I've said. Is these sorts of existential issues. And actually, a lot of it's driven by a desire to be in control. And we all like to be in control in our lives. I mean, I like to be in control in my life, as I'm sure you do too. But part of being human is understanding that there come times that we are dependent upon each other. And, we can address many of the physical and existential and emotional issues that are involved in approaching death through properly funded palliative care, which is not properly funded in this country and is unlikely to be properly funded.
You're right, but on the other hand, even if we had a perfect palliative care system, so I don't want to put words into your mouth, Paul, but I mean that would not solve this issue, would it? Because there would still be people. Well, you take up the argument.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I served on the Health Select Committee inquiry, a 14-month inquiry. We took 68,000 submissions and talked to people all over the world. And what was very clear on all sides, and that includes many people who have worked very closely with Gordon, everybody agreed that even the best palliative care could not prevent all the suffering. So it's not enough to say, let's have the best palliative care. We want that. I would campaign for that. There's provisions within Kim's bill to put the government on the spot to ensure that there is good palliative care. But it won't work for everybody, and everybody's agreed on that.
Do you accept that, Gordon?
Well, I think two things. First of all, there was one of the conclusions in the report which I disagreed with, and I think they did, what Nelson did at the Battle of Copenhagen, where he put his telescope up to his blind eye. There was an element of that going on with the committee's report, in that they said, well, there's no evidence that palliative care decreases, and that was not looking at the big picture. The big picture is that we have an ageing population in Western Europe. We have increasing demand for palliative care. Deaths are going to increase by 25% by 2040. And when you look at investment in palliative care across Western Europe, you find that there is more investment in those countries that don't legislate for assisted suicide or euthanasia than there is in those countries that do. So whatever the absolute figures, in real terms, in terms of the demand, palliative care is under pressure, and that's why Wes Streeting is saying what he's saying, that in our current palliative care system, bringing this in is going to be very dangerous.
I notice you refer to it as assisted suicide. You refer to it as assisted dying. I mean, are we playing semantics here? Can this really be described as suicide?
It is suicide, because what's happening is people are taking their own life ultimately. And Margot MacDonald in Scotland, where I'm from, the first time she brought a bill to the Scottish Parliament, she called it the End of Life Choices Bill, which is similar to what we're being presented with tomorrow. The second time, because there was a lot of criticism of that from within the committee at the time, she then renamed it the Assisted Suicide Scotland Bill, and she was more honest the second time. And it is suicide because people are taking their own life. Interestingly enough, we've just done an opinion poll, and it showed that 40% of respondents did not understand what the term assisted dying means by Dignity in Dying's own definition of that term. And that shows that opinion polls which come out, the public are very confused. They think it's with palliative care, they think it's withdrawing treatment, they think it's refusal of treatment. And so you can't really rely on the opinion polls that are being quoted.
I don't think we should get locked into semantics, but I think language is quite important. My dad took his life. He wasn't suicidal. He loved life. He lived it to the full for all of his 87 years. What he was concerned about was his death not leading him to the consequences he'd seen for some of his friends. That's not suicidal. It's not people ending their lives. It's people mitigating the fears that they have about their death. And what's interesting about Oregon, where actually the laws are strictly limited to terminal illness, what's interesting about Oregon is that something like a third of the people that are approved for an assisted death never actually take the medication because things don't get bad enough as they fear. It's about giving agency and control. It's a bit of insurance policy. And it means that in their last weeks and days, people can live their lives to the full.
Right, well, in a moment, we're going to come to your calls. If you've got questions for both of our guests, or you just want to tell us your experiences and your views, be my guest, 0345 6060 973. 17 minutes past 8.
LBC.
When it comes to
leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
18 minutes past 8. Paul Blomfield is here, chair of the campaign group Dignity in Dying, and Dr. Gordon MacDonald, chief executive of the campaign group Care Not Killing. Are you a medical doctor?
No.
Right. Oh, well, I won't ask any further questions on that. Then. Right. Let's go. It's overdue that we go to your call. So let's go to Victoria in Leytonstone. You've been very patient with me, Victoria. What would you like to say?
Well, I just wanted to say that from my experience with my father dying when he was at the end of life with Parkinson's disease, it was incredibly harrowing. And after what had happened in the hospital, I realised that euthanasia is happening in our hospitals anyway, with no regulation. When my dad got to the end of his disease, for which there was very little information about what happens when you die, it's actually very hard to find out. And it was really important for me to know what was going to happen to my dad and how he was going to feel. That would help me make decisions about his care. There was no palliative care available because it was apparently filled up. He was going to die. He couldn't swallow anymore. So the option was to put in a feeding tube, which would just let him lie there like a zombie in pain. And apparently it would have been very painful, I was told. And they had a saline drip put in for fluid. And then no one came to sort of let me know what the next steps were. I had to ask these questions myself. And it was really hard. And it was hard to find anything on the internet even. And I did find a brilliant website called Dying Matters, which was terrific. It was a really great support, but there's no people. Finally got the answer that once his vein collapsed, the hospital would no longer put in another drip. And I said, well, what happens then? And they said, well, the body can't survive longer than 5 days without food or water. Water is the big one. And I said, okay. So what happens is, well, people usually die within 5 days. So we were given this, 5 days seems a short number when you say 5, but you multiply that by 24 hours. This is a very, very long time to be waiting for something like this, watching my father twitch and be very agitated. I couldn't tell if he could hear me. I couldn't tell if he was cognitive, his eyes staring into nowhere, but his body was moving. It was horrific. Mm. And on the last day, which of course I didn't know was the last day, I was terrified. And because, to be with someone when they're dying, there's no lessons for that. We don't talk about it in this country. I don't know if we talk about it in other countries, but no, everyone just sanitizes it down. And my dad was in a corner of a big, busy ward with no privacy, and he was dying. And we just had to sit there in the corner of this ward and wait. And it was dreadful. My mother missed his death completely. My brother and I were there, and just about 2 hours before he finally died, the nurse came to me and said, we can give him as much morphine and Valium as you tell us to. And I said, right, well, what will that do? And she said, well, it'll make it a bit shorter. So what do you do? I felt like I was killing my dad. But he was going to die anyway, and it was not nice. It wasn't a nice way to go. It was painful for him, very obviously, from the state of his body. He couldn't communicate. I don't know how much he could hear, so we just kept talking, and I'm a singer, and I sang to him, and he died in my arms, and it took a very long time to accept that this is what has happened to him, and I was responsible for his death one way or another because I was the only person there. And I think there needs to be support for the relatives. It just doesn't exist. And we're left to pick up the pieces and bury them. And we don't have any support or care afterwards either. You're just expected to get on with it, which I have, but it was traumatizing. It really, truly was.
Well, I've talked about it on the programme before, so I'm not going to repeat myself tonight, but I went through a similar experience to you, Victoria, with my mother, and it will stay with me for the rest of my life, where you are a very eloquent woman, you're clearly very intelligent. I was in a situation where I felt completely helpless, totally not in control of the situation. My sisters felt exactly the same, and we felt that we'd let our mother down.
Yeah, I did. And I was very close to my father, and he always said to me he wanted to die peacefully in his sleep. And I remember saying to a social worker when she called me, and I said, you know what? I said, we're kinder to dogs. And she said, I beg your pardon. And I said, we're kinder to them. We don't let them be in pain. And then she agreed.
Yeah.
She agreed. The social worker agreed. But those nurses are helping us, supposedly. I don't know how you want to put it. One of the people on the show would say, oh, well, they're killing them. The other one would say, we're letting them out of pain. You take your pick. It's a personal thing. But we need to talk about it. And this bill is good. This is getting people to talk about it. This bill would never cover what my father or other people are going through right now in hospitals right now. There are people dying every minute, aren't there? And some of them are dying peacefully and a lot of them are not. But we need to have these conversations. It's cruel what we're doing. Well, letting people starve and to death.
Let's explore that with my guest, Victoria. Thank you for your call. I'm sorry you had to wait so long, but
it's okay.
Believe me, from our point of view, it was worth you hanging on, because I think just had a text here. My heart goes out to your current caller, says Sandra. Gordon and Paul, I mean, let's explore this issue of what happens in hospital, because do we all agree that we know that doctors and nurses in hospital do help people on their way? I mean, I don't know how it's regulated, but we all know it happens. Would you accept that, Gordon?
Well, I think that what happens is that people are dying, and doctors and nurses, if it's good palliative care, seek to treat the symptoms, and they do that.
But the nurse that Victoria referred to there, who said, well, we can give any dose of morphine, which I mean, it sounds sort of very exaggerated view of what they actually say, because they've got to cover themselves, because they don't want to be in a situation where they're arrested. But it's quite clear that in every hospital up and down the country, this happens.
Well, the medical doctors I talk to about this will say that morphine will not kill people, actually, and morphine is not used when, in countries that have legalised assisted suicide or euthanasia. But what happens is that people are dying, and it may be that the dose of morphine speeds that up, obviously, but people are dying anyway, and it's very difficult for them to know whether it's that final injection that has led to the death or whether the person was going to die anyway. In fact, I think what Victoria has picked up on, and it's a really important point, actually. I had two experiences with my parents dying. One was in a hospital context where my dad ended up in ICU for 2 weeks, and then eventually this life support was withdrawn. And one was with my mother in a hospice. And with my mother's situation, it was very interesting, because she was in an acute ward in hospital for 3 weeks, and she was quite down, and she was clearly not having a good time in that ward, and the nurses and the staff were very, very busy, and it was only in the last day that they called the palliative care consultant to come and see her. And then she ended up in the hospice, and she made a comment to me a few days later. She said, just this place is wonderful, and the whole environment in the hospice was so different. And I think part of the problem is that acute hospitals, where most people die, are not a good place to die.
No.
That's the bottom line here.
Well, my mother was put on the Liverpool care pathway without us being told that she was... And there was one day when the penny dropped. And I said to the doctor, I said, so she is going to die? Yes. I said, right, we're taking her home. And the fight that we had to persuade that hospital to let us take our own mother home, to this day, I find it completely unforgivable. Paul, what's your response to that?
Well, Iain, I think you're right in the way that you describe your experience, and unforgivable that as a family you didn't have control over the manner of her death. And I think most people wouldn't want to die in a hospital. They'd want to die at home, sometimes in the supported environment in a hospice. And Victoria was right in saying we need more palliative care, but I think the important point at the heart of her argument was about not talking about death. It's something we're not good about as a society. And I think she was right as well in saying that Kim's bill has opened up this discussion. And I think that with new laws in place which enable doctors to talk openly with patients about how they feel about their situation and their final journey, it's kind of liberating, which is what we've heard from doctors who are involved in assisted deaths in Australia and New Zealand. But I think that that conversation has got to change. And clearly, and I'd agree with Gordon on this, hospitals are under so much pressure. Medics are under so much pressure. I've personally experienced relatives who've actually been in and out, but acutely ill within the last couple of years, who have not had the support, relatives, their relatives, their loved ones, not being kept fully informed, not being enabling them to make choices. So there's a real issue there, but I think that I do think if we can have more open conversations, we're in a much better place.
Well, we're going to have a much more open conversation over the next half an hour. We've got lots of calls to get through as well, so do keep them coming. 0345 6060 973. If you don't get through first time, do keep trying. We're going to be talking about this right up until 10 o'clock. It's 8:30. And the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The UK and Iraq have agreed a joint plan to tackle people smuggling gangs after net migration reached a record high. The agreement will see failed Iraqi asylum seekers returned home more quickly. Transport Secretary Louise Haigh has admitted pleading guilty to an offence in connection with misleading police in 2014. It's reported she mistakenly reported her phone had gone missing during a mugging while standing as a parliamentary candidate. And the TV presenter Greg Wallace has thanked people for showing their support in a social media post. It's after the 60-year-old stepped away from presenting MasterChef following allegations of inappropriate sexual comments. LBC weather: heavy rain for the far north of the UK tonight. The odd shower for southern Scotland and Northern Ireland, and a low of 0.
This is LBC.
Hey, Harry.
On LBC.
8:32, Paul Blomfield, chair of the campaign group Dignity in Dying, is here, and Dr. Gordon MacDonald, who's chief executive of the campaign group Care Not Killing. They've been incredibly civilised so far, but there is 27 minutes to go. Don't let me down, because I want to continue this tone. Let's go to another call. It's Claude in Richmond Park. Hello, Claude.
Hi, Ian.
Hi. What would you like to say?
So I'm massively concerned, especially as a country regional representative for persons with disabilities and our disability rights. the safeguarding issues I have is that we're not like Australia in regards to investment into our home affairs and ensuring that we have a health system that is able to deliver this bill and the measures that this bill will open up to.
Well, just explain that. What have Australia got that we haven't?
So in regards to the fact of investment and in fact that we've got doctors that are migrating from the UK to Australia because of the quality of life. And you just kind of have to think about these important safeguards and of how the bill can open up to extreme risk for people with disabilities.
Like what?
Well, like when basically we're talking about inheritance and the element of people ensuring that people are going to be taking their life much more sooner without questions being answered, or that element of basically, the safeguard elements of really, there's not enough clarity for me as a person who believes that there needs to be much more protections in place. There needs to be also much more responsibility if we're going to consider this bill. And also the element that everyone is dying, meaning in like the global south because of the climate emergency, and why we haven't got investment in general in other important elements before considering this policy, which is very questionable to me.
Let's put your points to Paul Blomfield. Paul, how can you reassure Claude that disabled people aren't going to find themselves, I don't know what the expression is, but sort of not under attack, but are they vulnerable to this sort of legislation?
Well, I'm really glad that Claude's raised this because it is a concern that people have, and it was one of the concerns that I know Kim Leadbeater heard when she was consulting widely in preparing the bill. And it's why there are two safeguards here. One is to say that the bill is strictly limited to those with terminal illness and a prognosis of 6 months. And to make that absolutely crystal clear and to underline that point, it specifically precludes disability. And I know Kim has said in Parliament that she's as strong a supporter of rights for the disabled community as anybody, and it's why Tom Shakespeare, who you'll know was knighted for being probably the most renowned voice from the disabled community, has backed this bill and said that if it's limited to terminal illness, why shouldn't disabled people have the same rights as anybody else if they're terminally ill? If they're not, it doesn't apply. Gordon,
are you reassured by that?
No, not at all, because many of us end up disabled as we get older. Being disabled is not a separate category for many people who are terminally ill. And so the question then becomes is what sort of attitudes permeate through the healthcare system, which are already there in relation to disabled people. So people like Baroness Jane Campbell, for example, or Tanny Gray-Thompson will tell you that when they go into hospital, their relatives have to fight to stop doctors putting do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation orders on them and things like that. There is already an attitude within society which sees disabled people's lives as being of less worth than other people's lives. And sadly, that does permeate through the healthcare system. So when you bring this in as well, then that will compound that problem. And that's why they are concerned, and that's why they will be outside Parliament tomorrow expressing their views, and why Liz Carr, is very articulate on this too. So although Tom Shakespeare, who has been for a long time supportive of a change in the law, most advocates for disabled people are opposed.
But what about the argument that Paul just put, that disabled people should have the right to take advantage of this just as any able-bodied person should?
Well, if the law changes, they will, of course, if they meet the legal criteria. But the issue then is, how do you say if somebody's got 6 months to live or not? I have a former colleague whose father was given 6 months to live. He lived for 11 years. Doctors are not necessarily good at accurately predicting how long people have to live.
That is quite a telling argument, isn't it, Paul?
It's an argument that's come up, and I think that what doctors will say, and what they have said, is that the closer you are to the end of your life, the easier it is to make a firm prognosis, and 6 months is fairly close. Now, I've also had friends who've had prognosis that have thankfully been proved to be spectacularly wrong. But that's something to celebrate. I think that we need to understand that in this situation...
But if they're already dead, you can't celebrate it, can you?
But that's the point I was going to make, Ian. That I think sometimes people have a misconception that you get a prognosis of 6 months, you apply for an assisted death, you're signed off by 2 doctors confirming that prognosis. So it's not just one opinion, it's 2 opinions. And then you pop the tablets. Not the case. What people are wanting, as I was saying earlier, the experience of Oregon proves, is the opportunity to have control if things get bad. If they don't get bad, people aren't going to die before their time. They will. All the campaigners that we've had who are involved in this, who are dying, are celebrating their lives while they can. They want the insurance of knowing that they're going to be able to take control when pain becomes too much, so that they can celebrate them as much of the life as they have left.
Well, you mentioned the phrase take control there. Obviously, that was a slogan, or take back control was a slogan in the Brexit referendum. Well, Nathan says something like this should go to a public referendum. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with that. If we were in the Republic of Ireland, it would automatically go to a referendum, wouldn't it? Because they've had all sorts of things in this, not this particular issue, and they would have citizens' assemblies. There would be a big national debate about it. Would a referendum be appropriate here, do you think, Paul?
I don't think so, really. I mean, I think there's been lots of polling. The public are overwhelmingly in support. Tomorrow is an opportunity for Parliament to catch up with the public. And I don't think there's an appetite. I mean, I can understand the point that's being made, but I don't really think that there's an appetite to have a referendum on the issue.
I think this issue is one where the more people know about it, the less likely they are to support it. So that's the challenge with a referendum or a citizens' assembly, for example. And that's why Parliament has rejected it every time, because politicians, the more they've thought about it, the more they've decided that they don't want it. And this opinion poll we just did last week showed that when you present the arguments against and people think about what's happening overseas, you see that support falls away very rapidly from 73% down to 11%. So only 10% or just over 10% of the population actually strongly support this. And that's not a huge surprise. You might say only 10% strongly oppose it, and 80% of the population actually don't really know what they think, and the more they think about it, the less likely they are to support it.
OK, well, let's go to Colin in Bexley and see what he thinks. Hello, Colin.
Hi, Ian. All right. My father died of prostate cancer on Christmas Day 1999. And I watched the pain he went through, and he was on morphine. And I'm 54 now, and I wouldn't want to go through that. I said the simple, he wasn't with it. He was on morphine. He was out of it. He was getting a little sponge that had been frozen with water to keep his lips dry and stuff. And I remember saying to him, I'm going to watch, we're playing Hibs tomorrow. And his eyes opened wide and he screamed. And he absolutely screamed. And I was like, and he's on morphine. I always thought, I used to be in the army, I always thought morphine took the pain away. But he was on morphine drip and it doesn't. And me as a person who watched what my dad went through, I wouldn't want to do that, because he must have been so much pain on morphine to scream, and his eyes opened wide, and it was so upsetting. And I don't know why politicians and religious people and this and that, why can't they keep their thoughts just, I don't get it. I mean, if I was to say, I'm 54, right? My dad died at 57, so, oh my God, 3 years older than me, as I am now. Why can't I say something out to say, if this happens to me, I want to go? I put 2 golden Labradors down that were healthier than my dad was when he died. And that's all I've got to say.
Well, that is an argument which a lot of people put forward. I've had to do that twice to two very beloved dogs that I've had. It's something that you never want to have to do, but you know that you're doing a kindness. You know that you're doing the right thing. So, Gordon, why do we treat our animals better than we do humans?
Well, humans are not animals, and that's fundamentally the reason
actually,
why.
Sort of.
We consider ourselves to have higher value, intrinsic value as human beings, which is why it's not right. That's why we have laws which say that you can't, kill people, basically. And it's because we have traditionally, over a millennia, even from the time of Hippocrates, taken the view that doctors should not seek to intentionally harm their patient, should not seek to kill their patient, but rather to alleviate suffering.
But that's what I'm sure, well, Paul, you can argue it yourself, but I'm sure you would argue that that's what they would be doing in some circumstances.
Yes, but the issue then becomes what is the impact on other people who then feel that they're a burden and that they have no choice. And, we are all vulnerable ultimately in our lives. None of us are these invincible autonomans who are not dependent on other people. Ultimately, we're all going to be vulnerable. And so do we create a society where people who are in that sort of vulnerable position feel that they're a burden and that they should really do the decent thing? And that's the danger. Even if the family don't feel that and don't want them to have those thoughts, it's almost an internalized pressure, and it's perfectly understandable. And what people need at that time is to know that they're loved, and to know that they're cared for, and to know that we will support them through the dying process.
Paul, I was told earlier that on the Today programme, Kim Leadbeater actually said, she was asked the question about what about the burden issue, and she said, well, it's a perfectly valid reason to do it. Well, I don't know whether she was misquoted to me or not, but I did think that was possibly not the strongest argument in favour of assisted dying.
Well, I didn't hear Kim speak. I'm sure that's not her view, and I couldn't comment on something I hadn't heard, but I do want to take up Colin's point, if I might, because his experience of his father's death is what drives so many people to support our campaign. And, despite Gordon's point that he's conducted one poll, which coincidentally finds out in his favour, consistently over 30 years, when we looked at it at the Select Committee, support for assisted dying had stood at around 75%. But the point is here...
and support for the death penalty is more than 50%. I mean, you wouldn't argue... Well, I assume you wouldn't argue for that.
I assume we're not debating it tonight. But the point I wanted to...
We can do if you want to.
Public opinion is not always right, is it? That's the point.
No, but I think in this, and this is different from the death penalty, what drives public opinion on this issue is people's personal experience of seeing loved ones die badly. And the point I'd like to put to Gordon, because it's all very well talking about the theory of this, is the practicalities. I mean, one of our campaigners, Sophie, who has featured quite strongly in the campaign, she's been widely interviewed, is dying, stage 4 breast cancer, which has moved to other organs. She's allergic to opioid painkillers. There is no palliative treatment that can promise her that she will not suffer a painful death. She wants an assisted death at the point at which it becomes too much for her own sake and for her family's sake. And that's a burden issue. What would you say to her, Gordon, in terms of why you wouldn't permit her to have that pain-free death?
Well, I mean, I would put a question back to you, Paul.
No, answer his question before. I mean, you can do that, but answer his question first.
Well, I think, I don't know about her situation. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't comment on whether or not there are drugs that can address that. But what I would say is that ultimately, doctors do sedate people who are unable to respond to the pain relief. And so people don't need to have a painful death, but the option of sedation, I accept, is not something that people necessarily want. But there are options available. But if we take emotive personal stories, and a lot of this debate is about that, although actually we need to, certainly as politicians, we need to take a step back from emotive personal stories and look at the wider impact on everybody. But, we see what's happening in places like Canada, where people are not being given support for wheelchairs. They're opting for this because they fear being made homeless, or because they can't afford the care that they need. And where there's one particular individual who went to the hospital and was in the hospital, and the nurse came in and said to her, you're not existing, you're just living. Why don't you do the decent thing and just go for what they refer to as medical assistance in dying, which is assisted dying. So, that's what happens when you change the law. And
well, it can do, and it obviously, the Canadian system clearly has a lot of faults in it. But then we were talking to Julian Huppert, whose mother died in Australia through assisted dying. I think the system only came in about a year ago. There are 31 countries, I think, that have brought this in. Canada's always used as the one that, where things haven't gone quite right, and there has been a bit of a slippery slope. But there are other countries where it has worked. It's not impossible to make it work, is it?
Well, it's interesting because in Canada, of course, people said that those advocating a change the law said, we'll not be like Belgium and the Netherlands. It'll only be for a few people, a small number of cases. And it's got completely out of control. And they're worse than Belgium and the Netherlands now, actually, not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of, some of the cases that are hitting the headlines.
How do you answer that, Paul?
I'm really frustrated with the way that Canada is being used in this debate, because it has never, and Gordon, you know this is true, it has never limited assisted dying to terminal illness. The first assisted... Well, it is true, and that was what the Health Select Committee found. You subsequently come up and let Iain know afterwards where in any legislation or any court judgment it's been limited to terminal illness, because that's not the case in Canada. And when it started in 2015, it was a broader law. What we found as a select committee was that in every country, and every jurisdiction, which had started with the law limited to terminal illness, it stayed with terminal illness. But the other point that you didn't really answer about how do you deal with unavoidable pain, you said, there are always drugs that will sort that. Well, that's not true.
I didn't say that.
Well, you suggested it. What the head of Hospice UK, the chief executive of Hospice UK, told the select committee when we had our inquiry was that it would be wrong to suggest that even the best palliative care can alleviate all suffering.
Right, we need to take a short break, and then we'll come straight back and take another call. It's 8:51.
LBC, this morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
The head of the key day on the assisted dying debate, veteran campaigner Dame Esther Ranson's response to critics who say legalising it will be a form of state-sponsored death.
People who worry about the state intervening in our deaths, well, that is what is happening at the moment. The state is compelling people who are suffering an agonising death to continue suffering.
Ray is inferring this affects you personally, is that right?
Yes, I've got stage 4 cancer, melanoma. It's just a very simple choice, really. It's my body, my choice.
Louis in Guildford.
I've just lost my second sister-in-law to cancer. The last 2 weeks were excruciating. She was in so much pain, and you could see it, you could feel it, but they cannot get out of this pain.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
Luton
LBC. Text 84850.
8:54. Let's go to Colin, who's a new caller in Dorchester. Hello, Colin.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi, what would you like to say?
Okay, so I'm concerned about this bill. In the 1980s, when I was a young man, I became the carer of a friend of mine called Alison. Her spine was collapsing. She was in the most horrendous pain. I've never seen anyone in the sort of pain that she was in. She was a wheelchair user. She was double incontinent. She had constant nausea. She had infections. Her life was wretched, and she wanted to die. She had tried to end her life unsuccessfully. Doctors at the time gave her months to live, less than 6 months to live. And if there had been a law like the one Kim Leadbeater is proposing, she would have been grateful that there was such a law. She would have applied for it, she would have qualified for it, and her life would have ended. And nobody would have known that the doctors were entirely wrong to think she had just months to live. I became her carer in August of 1989 and stayed with Alison as her full-time carer until she died in December 2013, which was more than 24 years later. And although her condition did not improve, in fact it got worse, what did change was her outlook on life. And after several years, and it did take quite a few years, she found a will to live, and she wanted to live. And she was grateful to be alive, and she was so grateful that there was no law that would have allowed her to end her life. And at the moment, the law is a safeguard. I mean, we hear so much, about these so-called strict safeguards which the law will bring in. What the bill would do is, in fact, remove the safeguard, which for Alison made the difference between life and death. She would have died. Her life would have ended. She would have, she would have been killed, whether at her own hand or with the assistance of others, and nobody would have known what lay in store for her. And the law at the moment is a safeguard, and we removed that safeguard for people like Alison and other vulnerable people, really at our peril.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, Paul. It's impossible to draft a law that can really cope with every single individual's different experience, isn't it?
You have to make laws that most effectively provide for most people. I mean, I'd be interested to know more about the case Colin raises, because it's and the condition that his friend Alison was facing, because it's very unusual, quite exceptional, I think, for doctors, for somebody who would be given a prognosis of a few months to live for 23 years. And I'm delighted.
But she clearly would have wanted to go through an assisted suicide in 1989, and she wouldn't have had those extra 24 years had she done so.
If, in fact, two doctors quite separately had confirmed that she was with a condition which would lead to death within 6 months. But the wider point about safeguards is an important one, because part of the argument, and for the last 4 directors of public prosecutions who are in charge of this stuff, including one who's the current Prime Minister, have all said that the existing law isn't fit for purpose because it doesn't provide safeguards, for example, in relation to people who go to Dignitas. There's no suggestion, that people are talking about coercion as a problem. It doesn't apply in relation to Dignitas. There's no protection for those who choose to take their lives by starving themselves to death.
I'm going to give the final word to Gordon.
Yeah, I would just like to thank Colin for his comments there, because I think he's highlighted exactly what the problem with this law is. The law is a safeguard. It's a safeguard not only against people who may have transient depression or desire to die because of their circumstances. It's also the safeguard against people who may have some nefarious purpose in trying to encourage other people to die. And so that's why There have actually been very few prosecutions under the assisted suicide law. There's only been 3 convictions, but there have been 3 convictions, and that's because some people have a bad motivation. And I heard Max Hill speaking at the Dignity and Dying Fringe meeting at the Labour conference.
He's the DPP.
He is the former DPP, and he said, I had 27 cases came across my desk, and I only prosecuted one of them. And then I bumped into him the next morning, and I said to him, the issue is not the 27 cases that came across your desk. It's all the cases that didn't come across your desk because this law was in place. People who might have been tempted to encourage other people to commit suicide or to end their life because of, the opportunity is there. And we've seen what has happened in some of the scandals, the Gosport scandal, where people have been now referred to the CPS, cases have been referred to the CPS, other cases like that. We cannot assume that everybody has a good intention the whole time.
Well, I wish we had longer with you two, because it's been a fascinating hour. I won't hear anybody who says that there's been a better debate about the subjects on any other media over the past 2 months. I hope you've both found it useful. I hope you've both felt that you've had an opportunity to have your say. It's been great to get the calls, and thank you very much indeed. Now, in the next hour, we're going to take many more of your calls, but we're also going to talk about the role of religion in this, because there is a suspicion that some MPs are being influenced by their own religious convictions as to how they would vote in this. Now, in some ways, I want to say there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you are influenced by your religion, why not be open about it? Why sort of almost be ashamed of it? I don't think anyone should be ashamed of their religion, whatever it is. So we're going to explore that, but we'll take your calls with your experiences as well until 10 o'clock. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call here on LBC.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Sir Keir Starmer has promised graft, not gimmicks, to drive down migration after it rose to a